Alright, we're going to talk about OOP. Time for OOP. OOP. Yeah, this isn't really going to be a class. This is just me talking to you, and we're just recording. Yeah. Alright, so you don't need any of this. And forget all this. Okay.
Start from scratch.
Yes, so classes. So we're going to start. I'm just going to make a little skeleton here. Oh. This is not French. Looking good. Objet? Oh. Objet. I don't know. That sounds like Russian or something. Dog equals doggy. Good going. Okay, so here we're instantiating this class. And that basically just means creating an object that is an instance of this class, or is there another way to say that? Probably not. I guess of this type. Doggy is now a type.
So dog is a type of doggy?
No. Dog is an example of doggy.
Okay.
You can have multiple. Doggy 2 is another example of doggy. You know, like these are both objects and they're type doggy, the same way we are both objects of type person.
Okay.
So the confusion was about attributes. So like I said a little earlier, you can slap attributes on stuff whenever you want, but it's not necessarily a good idea.
So dog.pos has nothing to do with the class.
So what you're doing here is you're attaching so you're adding basically the variable pause to the dog namespace. Like the dog object now has associated with it a variable named pause with the value yes.
Okay. And
if you don't mind me doing some magic Python stuff, you can see here dog.
That lists the attributes.
Right, so these are all like secret Python attributes with special meanings that we're not going to talk about right now. And then down here at the end of the list is the one we just added.
Okay.
And you can grab any of these things that you see here. So like this is the class. So line 18 up here just printed, yeah. So
okay, yeah.
This is like the generic way a class gets printed if you don't have a nice way to print the class. Just as like the name and where it came from and stuff. Okay, so this is not a good way to do it. You don't want to just put things on ad hoc all over the place because it becomes really hard to track. And if at some point in the future you want to know exactly what does a dog have, you can't just go look it up. You have to search your whole program for any place where
okay,
you may be, you know what I mean?
It's better to have it in one place where you can see all of them.
Right. So like even here, you don't even know, like, am I defining it here or am I just changing the value? We don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
So you don't want that. So instead what you do...
Wait, can we pause?
Maybe? Probably not. Why was up?
The dog.
Like our actual dog?
The actual dog might have to go out.
Yeah, okay. No, sure, we can pause. We'll make it... So...
We're back.
What were we talking about?
Attributes?
We were going to do attributes, right. So, what you want to do basically is all of the attributes you plan on using, like this one, you want to put them in the init method. And the reason you want to do that, well, the biggest reason that I really think is...
Wait, so what is an attribute?
An attribute is a piece of data, basically, a variable that is attached to a object of some kind.
I understand. Like, doggy would have paws, maybe like coat color? Is that?
Sure.
Yeah.
It might have
owned or stray. Is that one?
Sure.
Why are you putting why are you already putting like yes, green, true, true?
Yeah, so Well, if you just did, like, say, for example, I don't know, feet, right? So this, if you're not assigning it a value, then it assumes you're trying to use this value, and since this value is not defined, that's an error.
Well, it's going to be either yes or no. Coat color can be many different things.
Yeah, you'll change it later, though, if you need to. These are basically, these count as default values, essentially.
Okay.
And, I mean, you can also do it, for example, let's say, you know, owned. You can do it this way. And so now when you initialize a doggy, you'll have to pass in a value for owned, and that value will be attached to the doggy object here.
So do we need to have all of those in the parentheses by init?
No, you just, you don't need to have any of them. This is basically, this works just like a normal function. So for example, the same way up here, let's say we're defining a function like so. You can have a function with no arguments that does nothing if you want. You can have a function with no arguments that defines a variable and then does nothing with it.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a function with no arguments that defines a variable and returns a variable. Or you could give the function an argument and return it that way. It doesn't really matter. Like, what you put up here is, all this does is allow you to essentially do a bunch of definitions before the function starts running.
Okay.
So now when you call the function, you'll pass it a, we're going to avoid that real quick. You'll pass it a value for v, and a value for o, and a value for p. Oops. And in fact, you have to. If you were to leave one of them out like this, then it would give you a nice error here. So it takes exactly 3 arguments, but you only gave us 2, and therefore we exploded.
Okay.
If I put that back, everything will work, but we're not printing anything there. So we printed the v that we passed in, basically. But this is the same as if, like, if you imagine like a magical thing here, and we were to do like this.
Okay, yeah.
At the beginning.
And then you can put as many as you want.
Right, but like by having the arguments here, by defining them like this, we're essentially achieving this. We're just doing it up here in the definition.
Okay.
And there's a lot of good reasons to do this. One obvious one is that you can see what those are supposed to be. If you have something like this, you don't even know how many is expected or how many there should be, whatever. Okay, anyway. So these methods in the class definition, these are just functions. And
Attributes, right?
So functions on a class are called methods. They are also attributes, and you can treat them like attributes, and they work just like attributes.
So methods are attributes.
Methods are attributes because everything is an attribute.
Okay.
Methods are also functions.
I thought the self.pause, self.cocolor, I thought those were attributes.
They are attributes. So you'll notice here, if we look back at our doggy object, oops. What happened? Init takes 2 arguments. Oh, right. So because I put this here, it's now expecting that to be given here. So we're going to put like so. So what you see down here are all of the attributes of doggy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is, in fact, this init function that we just wrote up there. And, you know, we also have all the ones that we added. Coat color, nose is wet, whatever. So functions are attributes too.
Okay.
But for some reason, we call functions on a class methods. I don't know why we do this. It really doesn't... I mean, it doesn't... I guess it lets you, the listener, know specifically that I'm talking about a class and its attached function and not just a random function.
Yeah, okay.
Right, so because they work just like functions, you can basically do everything you'd expect to do with a function. This is not recommended whatsoever, but you could just, for example, call it again. Print dog. Wait, we can't print dog. Print dog.owned. So this is false now, because when we called this function again, owned was false, and so it overwrote the previous one. Like the first time we called it here, this calls the init function, creates a doggy object,
Yeah.
and then returns it to us after running this code. And that was the dog object, right?
Yeah.
The dog object had that attribute, which was in fact this function that we just wrote.
Okay.
And so we can access it just like we can access every other attribute, and we can call it because it's a function. And so really this is the same as if we had done, I'm just showing that we can call this function again. That's
Okay.
all we're doing
Okay.
here. Not recommended really to be calling the double under functions on your own. Basically, just don't do that. Yes, so the thing that sets apart this function from if we were to make the exact same function out here, which we could do,
Yeah.
is this self guy. Oops, I'm all over the place. This guy.
Mm-hmm.
So when you call a method of an instance,
Yeah.
it automatically passes the instance as the first argument.
Self.
Self is the conventional name that we give
For instance.
for the first argument, which is the instance. You could name this whatever you wanted, and everything will work just like always.
Okay.
Because this is really just another argument.
So self is the instance.
Yeah, so right here,
Banana.
banana is the doggy object that we just created. So we called here doggy true, and this gets translated basically to calling this guy with like our new object. This is not wholly accurate, but basically, so like our new object is right here. It got created, like our new dog object.
Yeah. This one.
Right. And so it calls this function. This guy is the same exact guy that we're assigning to this name out here.
Okay.
So if we do like ID of banana, and this is ID is a unique number which identifies an exact instance of an object.
Mm.
So if you have two exactly equal doggy objects, but they're actually two objects, they just have totally equal values in all ways, you can still tell them apart because they'll have different IDs. And down here we can also check the ID of dog, and we will see, assuming no gamma rays interfere with anything, that these...
Like a fingerprint.
Right. So these are in fact the same because these are the same two objects, right?
Okay.
This dog is banana. Like it's not equal to banana,
So
it is banana.
is self an object?
Self, so
It represents an object?
so self is a name, and there is an object, and we're assigning that object to the name self in this namespace, or scope, I guess, right here. So like
what is our object here? Dog?
it's the instance
Dog
of
on-
doggy, which we will later call dog.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
could, like,
So
there's nothing
self is
special
a
about the
name
word dog, and there's nothing
for
special about the word
instance of doggy, which we are calling dog
later. Yes.
on line 6. Well,
Uh,
your lines keep changing. I don't know.
Right. So it's relative line number. So when we're on a line, that's the line number,
Okay.
and otherwise, let me just turn that off.
Then
Actually,
it's line 20.
there we go. Right. And yeah, so the point I was making was this works like a regular function, meaning you can name these whatever you want, like, whatever. And
What is
that
the bazooka now?
it's the same as before. It's just the name for the second argument to the function.
Okay.
Period. That's all you're doing here, defining the names to the arguments of the function. And
How do
self
you decide what the arguments are?
it's
Self
what,
has to be an argument, right?
right, but self is this is the only magical thing about methods on instances. When you call it when you call a function on a class, the instance is passed as the first argument, whether or not you do anything with it. So like, let me get rid of this guy right here. So here we're calling doggy with no arguments. And so this in Python code will translate to a call to the constructor of doggy with our new unnamed doggy instance as the first argument. And so here we're assigning the name self to this unnamed doggy instance. Oops. What am I doing? B. There we go. So it doesn't have to be self, was the point I was making. It can be anything else, because just like every other function, all this is doing is assigning a name to the value that is passed. When you call the function not on an instance, that doesn't happen. So here I put this in the parentheses to show that, like, in reality, when we call this function, it creates an object and puts it in there for us. Python is doing this in the background.
Okay.
If we call it manually, so we call it ourselves by calling the class doggy. So let me back up a little bit. Class. Okay, so here we're defining the name doggy.
Yeah.
Or we're declaring it, or whatever you want to say.
We're declaring it a class.
Yes, we're declaring here that there's a class, and that class is referred to by the name doggy. And so we can look at that. So the class itself is an object, just like everything else. And if we instantiate one of these guys, now it says, like, okay, now we have an object which is of, type doggy. Up here, we have an object which is of type class. And so, type. Well, okay, it's of type, I guess. So, like, this is a type is what it's saying, because we can have other values which have that type.
Yeah.
So you can do stuff with just the doggy class directly. So, like, let's look at all of the attributes of the doggy object, like the doggy class object. And so you can see all of these things which are just on the class. This is not a specific instance of the class. This is like the definition of it. So, for example, we say that, like, I'm an instance of person with, like, black curly hair, and you're an instance of person with brown eyes. But here we're just looking at, like, person itself.
Okay.
Like, what does person have?
Yeah.
And the analogy kind of breaks down because that doesn't make so much sense in the real world. But in Python, you can just look at the abstract object itself and just introspect it that way. So the point I was making was, if we call this init function ourself manually by just going into the doggy class, accessing the init function attribute, and then invoking it, it doesn't do this magic create an object for us and pass it as a first argument.
Yeah.
And so this fails. So unbound method init must be called with the doggy instance as first argument. But we didn't do that. We called it with no arguments.
Okay.
If we create a doggy, we can then stick it in there.
Yeah.
And now it will work.
Oh, you first need to create a doggy.
Right.
Okay.
So now it will work, but now it's acting just like a totally normal function.
Yeah.
It doesn't even return a doggy instance anymore. It just works exactly like a normal function. So because we returned nothing down here,
Mm-hmm.
it returned none, and so that's what printed.
Okay.
So the normal way to handle it, of course, is just to invoke the constructor like this. It creates you a doggy object. That doggy object gets put into the first argument of this thing, and then you work with it, and that's all that happens.
This doggy object,
Mm-hmm.
is that not dog?
Not yet.
Why not?
Well, up here, it doesn't exist out here yet. So what happens is Python interpreter goes down here, says, like, this is a comment, we'll ignore this one. This one tells us what encoding the file is in. Either you know what I just said or you don't, and we'll ignore that too. Then it gets down to here and it says, okay, we're making a new class. So Mr. Python like writes down in his notebook, we have a new type called doggy. It's a subclass of object. It has one function defined here called under init. The first argument to that function is called doggy object. And then it looks at the code for the function. And it says, okay, we're going to get the attribute pause on whatever doggy object is and assign it the value yes. We're going to get the attribute coat color on whatever doggy object is and assign it the value green, and so on. And then it says, okay, we're done with the function, we're done with the class definition. Then we get down here, just this thing again, to line 14. It says, okay, here we have an equal sign. So first I need to evaluate what's over here on the right, and we don't care at all what's going on this side yet. So it just does this side, this side alone. And so what it does is it says, okay, we're going to use type doggy, so it goes and gets the definition for doggy that we just made. And then it says we're invoking the constructor with no arguments here. And so it goes, this is the constructor, basically. So it goes and it invokes this init method. And it says, okay, because this is how Python works, basically, I take my newly formed object that I just made, and I pass it as the first argument to this function. And so we go through the function like we did before.
Why is it called doggy object and not dog? Isn't dog our object?
So in this function, we don't care what's going on out here.
Okay.
And like, in fact, this doesn't even have to exist. This is still a perfectly fine program.
Okay.
And we can print doggy directly. And there's our doggy object.
Okay.
Even though we didn't name it dog ever. So up here, doggy object is the name of the object.
Of our instance?
Yes, because the instance was created. It had no name. It's just created. And it's
but
passed.
Then every time you make an instance, is it going to be doggy object?
In this function, yes.
Okay. But out there, you can assign it to whatever you want.
Well, yeah, once you're out here, you can do whatever you want again.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is how functions always work,
Yeah.
right? So, we assign it to this word, doggy object,
Yeah.
which by convention is self, but I'm using doggy object here to illustrate. We can do whatever we want with doggy object. We can assign new attributes, we can like remove attributes, whatever. And then, by convention, after it has been run through this function, the Python interpreter will return the object that it used here. And so that's how you get your doggy object back out here again.
Okay.
And so then we say, okay, now that we've returned this object, I want to take this object that we got back over here, and I want to store it in the name dog. And now I have a name, dog, which refers to the doggy object. You can see here.
Can we change it back to self?
Yes.
So, can we try to make an instance and use these pause, co-color, and those things?
Sure. So we make an instance the same way we just were. And then at this point, you're free to do whatever you want. So the only speculation is that like this attribute lives on this object. And so if you want to access, for example, owned, owned itself is not defined out here.
Yeah.
Only dog.owned. So first we have to go grab the dog, and then we have to look at the dog for something called owned.
Okay.
When we look through our, like, essentially it's a dictionary of attributes on dog, and we grab the owned value, and then we can work with it. So this is true.
But how do you, because not all dogs are going to be owned.
True.
So how do you assign dog?
So the way it's written right now, by default, every dog is owned.
Yeah.
If you wanted to change that, it's just like any other variable. Like if you had, I don't know, a variable like, I don't know, my var, let's say, equals 2, and then later you want to make it equal to 7, you just say, okay, it's equal to 7 now.
So let's do that with dog.
Sure. So originally dog was owned. We can say now the dog is not owned anymore.
So you just need to know the default values.
You don't need to.
Well, if you want to make an instance with particular attributes, are they called?
So yeah, these are all attributes, these guys.
With particular attributes, then you need to know what the default values are, and so you can change them.
Right.
If you need to change them.
So the usual pattern, are you familiar with keyword arguments in a function? Like def foo, like first arg equals 2.
Yeah.
That looks, you know how this works.
That means the first argument is 2.
It is 2 unless you specify a first argument.
Okay.
I'll demonstrate. So we're not going to do that right now, and then I'll call foo down here. So here we didn't pass anything for the first argument.
Mm-hmm.
Python 3.
Are you using Python 3?
No, but my little thing that's checking for errors thinks I'm using Python 3, and so
Okay.
it complains about the print statement. So here, it printed 2, because that's what happened here.
Yeah.
And first arg right now is 2, because we didn't tell it otherwise. And it says, by default, first arg is 2.
Okay.
If we give it something else, then it replaces it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do that with this, because this is a function just like everything else.
Okay.
And so we can say by default pause are yes, and by default coat color
I thought we had already set those as default just by having it yes green true underneath.
Yeah. So this is okay. This is doing the same thing essentially. This is redundant now to have it up here and to have it here.
Okay, but my question was, how would you get an instance? Like, you would have to go back and look to see what the default values are so that you can customize your dog.
Right. So what you do typically is it's set up like this, and well, this is fine. Nose. I wish I had picked shorter variables here. Nose is wet. We want our doggy to be wet in the nose, and owned is true. And yeah, we'll go with this. Does it fit? Doesn't fit. So here, this is some ugly formatting. So here we have a bunch of keyword arguments, right? And so what this does, when you enter the function, we're assigning a variable pause. We're assigning it the value yes. This is not yet an attribute. This is just a variable. If we didn't assign it to the attribute down here, then it wouldn't do anything.
Okay.
So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, the variable that we named pause up here, we want to attach to the object pause. Yeah. The fact that you have to do this is really annoying, I think, personally, because you pretty much always do it. But, you know, it is what it is. So you just have to do it this way. Right, so this is how you normally handle default values.
Do you have to have default values?
No. So we could say, for example, pause is not going to be, there's no default value for pause.
Well, then you don't have to have it in parentheses, right?
No, you do. So you have to...
You can't just have self.pause equals pause?
Well, if pause wasn't up here at all, then it has no meaning here. So like when you look at this, you don't know, it doesn't have a value. There's nothing to put here. And so it can't assign it to any other place because there's nothing over here.
Yeah, okay.
And if you have it here without a keyword argument, then Python knows that this function requires 2 arguments. The first one is taken care of already because it's the instance. The second one has to be pause. If it doesn't get the second one, it explodes because it doesn't make any sense. There's no way to...
So how would you use this then?
So this is an error. So you would have to give it an argument. So pause 4. We have 4 pause on the dog. And now it works.
Okay.
I'll do like this, dog, and then print dog.pause. Right. So here we go. And And at this point, again, like this is just an attribute, and attributes are just variables, and the only difference is that they live on the dog. And so now you can work with this just like anything else. So, you know, if our dog is like a war vet and he lost 2 of his paws and now he only has 2 paws left.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, so this is like handling construction, I guess. The other thing you may want to do is attach just regular old functions for doing stuff.
Yeah.
So I choose bark.
So you always have to have self in there.
Right. There are some small exceptions, but let's not talk about them or worry about them right now.
Okay.
I'm going to do it like this. Actually, no. Actually, no. You know what? Bark is an action. This thing will do the action for us. So now if our doggy... Python 3, come on, man. Wow, this is a disaster. Yes, there we go. So now if our doggy barks... oh, right. I have to go set this default value.
Okay.
And this is just like any other function. You know, if we had just like done def bark,
Yeah.
dog object, print bark, and then invoked it ourselves, and then instead of letting Python magically give the first argument, we just did it ourselves. It works the same way.
So, can we take a look at my code and fix it? See what I did wrong.
Sure. So the last thing I want to talk about, though, real quick. Here we're not returning a value. We, of course, could return a value. We could, like, I don't know, just say, like, return the dog object. This makes no sense. But it's a recursive doggy. So now, when the dog barks, it returns not a copy, but, like, it returns its actual self.
Okay.
You see, this is like the same. This is a memory address. Same memory address, same dog.
Yeah.
Right, so these just work like regular functions, and the only really thing you have to care about is that the first argument will be the instance. And what that does is it lets you work with the attributes that you've been setting this whole time. So like bark could be like this, let's say. Come on. There we go. And now, so we blow off 2 dog paws again, unfortunately.
Okay.
So this is the dog, right? And
yeah.
so in here, we're accessing the attribute on the dog, and then he can, you know, whatever.
Okay.
And I guess that's enough for now.